In terms of research in area related to personalities and psychopathology, he's done everything under any condition, in every sector, and across lifespan. You name it, he's done it. And he's, if you want to see his accomplishments, his research, his publications, and everything else, there is such a thing as Google. So you can Google it. I'm not going to waste any time on telling you that. But you know what? He has supported us ever since the year 2000. So to me, he's the INPM family. And with his wife, Debbie, who's not able to be with us today, and I really miss her. And as a person, to me, he's more than an outstanding scholar. He's a wise, calm, caring, thoughtful friend. And as a scholar, he models for us to follow your passion, to explore unknown territories, and also the longevity of research. And please welcome Dr. Sal Maddi.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, good. Thank you for being here this morning. I'm going to cover two things today. One is a kind of summary of 30 years of theorizing, researching, psychotherapy, and consulting on hardiness. And the second thing is to try to expand hardiness in the direction not only of individuals, but also organizations. Okay? So that's the general sense of what I'm going to be covering. As you can see from the title, I want to make sure that you recognize that we're trying to get organizations into this too, okay? Now, let's start with our turbulent times. Basically, the assumption that we've made all along is that life is by its nature stressful. That's normal. It's not abnormal. Life is by its nature stressful. And this slide kind of covers it. In terms of mega trends over there on the right, life is naturally stressful. Basically, it's the developmental process for individuals that is by its nature stressful. Think of getting pushed out of your mother's womb when she gives birth to you. It's painful. And when you get out, the doctor slaps you on the back so that you have to begin breathing for yourself. There's lots of light and noise. It's hot, it's cold. Everything is different. That never was true before. That's what Otto Rank used to call the birth trauma. Okay, that's stressful. You begin to cry, right? Right, so then as time goes on a little bit, maybe you get to the point where you can crawl around. But when you crawl around, you keep bumping into things and hurting yourself, okay? So that's stressful too. And then, no sooner do you begin to form relationships with your family of origin, but you have to begin going to school. Your mother takes you to kindergarten and drops you off, and you cry. And why do you cry? Well, what you're used to isn't there anymore. You have to take orders from your teacher, and you have to begin trying to interact with other kids you don't even know, right? It's all stressful. Okay, maybe you assimilate to that finally, but then as time goes on, schooling goes on, when you're in high school or so, you have to begin thinking about what your life is going to be like. You're no longer simply a subordinate measure of your member of your family of origin. You have to sort of find out how to accomplish things for yourself in society. What should your career be? Should you form relationships with people? And if so, who? And how deep should the relationships be? And that continues on for quite a period of time. Then when you go to college, you're separated even further from your family of origin, and it becomes time to begin thinking of starting what the anthropologists call your family of reference. Okay? So do you let yourself fall in love with somebody? Do you choose to go to graduate school, or what kind of job do you start looking for? And that that continues to go on. Let's say you get married. Let's say you have a job. You begin having children of your own, and you have to begin helping them with their developmental stresses, which is stressful for you too as a parent. And in addition to that, your job may or may not work for you, and you have to figure out what to do, and and keep going, and then before very much longer, you've reached the second half of your life, and you begin looking back on the first half and worrying about dying, things like that, and and as you get older and older, your children need your help more. The people around you begin getting sick and maybe dying, and maybe you're getting sick too, and et cetera, et cetera. And I could go on forever, but in point of fact, developmentally speaking, life is by its nature stressful. Okay. Now, going further, if developmental stresses aren't enough, think of what happens when they're added to by external factors, socio-environmental factors that you have very little control over, okay? Like technological advances. I had to get help to put my disk in a computer this morning because I'm not the computer generation. I know a little bit, but not very much, right? Technological advances. Now, as soon as I master a computer program, it becomes obsolete, and I have to start over again. Now, for some people, that's easier than for others. For me, it's not so easy. So the technological advances are sources of stress, even though there's an upside, needless to say, but there's also a downside. Emerging globalization. One thing that's happened in our telecommunications industry is emerging globalization. I've had people come to me for psychotherapy related to that. For example, one investment banker who was having more and more anxiety because he was having to do business more and more with people in other countries, different cultures, whom he would never meet. But there was a lot of money at stake, right? So globalization, to say nothing of how globalization may have encouraged terrorism. Where here, cultures are being afraid of being made obsolete by the Americans, right? Okay, mounting competition. More and more competition all the time. One aspect of globalization is just that. The Irish economy has improved dramatically because they've learned how to write computer programs, and they get a lot of business from the United States because it's cheaper than hiring people here to do it. In the United States to do it. We're not in the United States here. But you see, there's mounting competition as a result of globalization and technological advance. Equal opportunities for women and minorities. That's an ongoing process in the United States and Canada, and that's all very good. It's wonderful. But of course, it also means that it's going to be stressful for both the people who are losing all of their capabilities, because now there are other people that need to be taken into account too. And also these people who are being taken into account get looked at critically by the people who are losing their capabilities. So there's a downside to this upside as well. Aging population. We're living longer and longer, And that is causing a lot of problems in jobs. There aren't so many jobs. It's not so easy to get jobs for younger people because the people are living longer and longer. In the academic world, those of you who are in it know what's going on. People, well, for example, me, I don't have to retire. In California, there's no mandatory retirement age. So they have to keep paying me. I have tenure, but it means that we can't hire younger people because there's no more money, right? So the aging population has obviously positive factors, but there's also negative factors in terms of stress for everyone. And then finally, economic fluctuations. I don't need to have to say anything about that. Think of what's happening now. Sometimes the economy is good, but a lot of times it's bad because it's up and down, right? So all of this imposes itself on individuals. These are examples of how life is by its nature stressful. Now, the trickle-down effect over there of mounting stress affects organizations as well. Companies reorganize, merge, start up, close down. Nobody knows what's going on, oftentimes. Imagine the people who are in it having to make decisions. It's very stressful. Imagine the stock owners. It's very stressful for them too. Job security is decreasing. Now, that's not only a function, that not only influences individuals, it influences organizations as well. Jobs come and go. Company loyalty is decreasing because nobody really thinks that they can stay in the same company for 35, 40 years and then get a retirement party and get their gold watch. It's not the way it happens anymore, right? So companies have problems because the employee loyalty is decreasing. Now, employers are struggling to keep and attract the best staff because they can't hire everyone, but it's very important for them to get the best staff, but it's really hard because those are the people who are being competed for by all of the organizations, okay? Employees are hard-pressed to bring the best out of their staff. Their staff is decreasing in loyalty, and here the employers are trying to do the best you can, right? Well, why? I'm just going to do what you tell me, and that's it, right? And then finally, companies need to turn changes to their advantage, and that's pretty hard too. It requires what's called transformational leadership, and that's hard for a lot of people who never learned it, okay? A lot of decision makers in organizations. In my consulting work, I've encountered supervisors who say, hey, they have to do what I tell them to do. And when they do it, I don't even have to reward them. They're just doing what they're supposed to do. That's not transformational leadership. And it's going to cause trouble because it would decrease the loyalty of the subordinates even more. Okay? So you get the idea. From my point of view, life is by its nature stressful. Now, what about that? What's the answer? Well, the answer is resiliency through hardiness. And by the way, be careful. For me, resiliency is not just surviving. It's thriving as well under stress. It's not just surviving under stress, but thriving under stress. That's the answer. And from our point of view, hardiness is the pattern of attitudes and skills that makes that possible. We'll get into that a lot more. Just let me see if we need to say anything on this slide. The other side of stressful change is opportunity. Okay, that's a way of looking at it. The other side of stressful change is opportunity. Okay. If you notice the book that I co-authored with my wife, Debbie Koshaba, and my wife and colleague, who couldn't be here today, she really is very sorry she couldn't be here. You know, its title is Resilience at Work, but the subtitle is not how to survive no matter what life throws at you. Instead, the subtitle is how to succeed no matter what life throws at you. It's not a matter of survival, it's a matter of success, okay? Resiliency is the fact of surviving and thriving under stressful circumstances. Okay, hardiness is the pattern of attitudes and skills that facilitates resiliency. I covered that enough already. The hardy attitudes are the 3 C's of commitment, control, and challenge. Now, commitment is the attitude you have that no matter how bad things get, you want to stay involved rather than pull back. The attitude of control is, no matter how bad things get, you want to keep trying to have an influence on outcomes rather than let yourself sink into powerlessness and passivity. And challenge, the 3rd C, is the belief that life is by its nature stressful, and this normal stress is an opportunity to grow and develop by what you learn, rather than the opposite of challenge, which is the belief that you're entitled to easy comfort and security. Okay? All right, so, and then there's this commitment, control, and challenge constitutes what we consider the courage and motivation to do the hard work of turning stressful circumstances from potential disasters into growth opportunities. It's hard work, okay? And that work involves the hardy skills of problem-solving coping rather than denial and avoidance, socially supportive interactions rather than interactions that where conflicts fester, and then finally beneficial self-care rather than self-care which is a sign of denial and avoidance and just undermines your health. Okay, so that's what it's all about, hardiness. It's a pattern of attitudes and skills that leads to turning potential stressful circumstances from potential disasters into growth opportunities. How about the discovery of hardiness? Some of you know this already, so I'll try not to spend much time on it. We discovered the empirical discovery of hardiness, I should say. We had done a lot of conceptualization already, but the empirical discovery of hardiness happened through our Illinois Bell longitudinal study. It was a 12-year study at Illinois Bell Telephone, headquartered in Chicago. That's when I was teaching at the University of Chicago, and where I met Debbie, my wife. She was a graduate student in one of the schools with Virginia Mullen there. They were students together. Yeah. But in any event, it was a 12-year longitudinal study, which is now considered a classic longitudinal study. What we did was we started studying 450 supervisors, managers, and decision makers at Illinois Bell Telephone. 450 volunteers. I was a consultant for Illinois Bell Telephone at the time, so it was easy for me to get to do this. And the study was paid for by not only the National Institute of Health, but also Illinois Bell Telephone. And every year, we studied these 450 subjects very, very carefully, psychologically and mentally. Physically. Mentally and physically, every year for those 12 years. What we were doing is waiting until the writing was already on the wall that our government, you see, at the time when we started the study, which was in 1975, I guess. Yeah, 1975. The telephone service was a federally regulated monopoly, because our government believed that cheap, reliable telephone service is in the national interest. Illinois Bell Telephone didn't have to make any profit. They didn't have to make any money. They just had to produce reliable and inexpensive telephone service for people. But the writing was on the wall because of technological advances, and our government was beginning to think, hey, we have to deregulate the telephone industry to make room for what's now become the telecommunications industry, where they wanted to encourage competition to get its development to be faster. And nobody knew exactly when that deregulation of the telephone industry would happen. But in 1975, we began studying these subjects, waiting for that deregulation to take place. It took place in 1981. And then we continued collecting data on these people for another 6 years, from 1986, which is when I went to the University of California in Irvine. Okay. And of course, what we found is that 2/3, from 1981 to 1986, 2/3 of the subjects in our sample fell apart. There were heart attacks, there was cancer, there was strokes, there was violence in the workplace, there were divorces, there were depression disorders, anxiety disorders. Okay? But you know what? The other third not only survived, they thrived. They did better than they had been doing before. Okay? So what we did was we ran back to the data before the upheaval from 1975 to 1981 to see how this 2/3 of the sample differed from the third that had survived and thrived. And that's how we got our first empirical signs of hardiness. What we found, of course, is that the ones who survived and thrived and this is where the model comes in. The ones who survived and thrived were much better at dealing with stressful circumstances. Now, what we found, of course, in our study is that stressful circumstances, both acute and chronic, acute is disruptive changes you didn't expect. Chronic is ongoing stressful circumstances. An example of a chronic stress is, let's say, you think you're a loving person, but you can't find the right person to lavish your love on, or you want to be really satisfied with your job, be creative at it, but all you can do is find routine jobs. Those are chronic stresses. Acute stresses are obvious, like automobile accidents, things like that. Somebody dying and your family dying without you expecting them to, things like that. Okay. Well, we found that stressful circumstances increase strain at the physiological level as well as the psychological level. Now, this is very similar to what Walter B. Cannon, talked about in 1928. I heard about that when I was a student, but we found this too. Strain levels, physiological strain levels, and psychological tension levels increased as a result of stresses. The more stress, the more strain. But and of course, if nothing is done to moderate that strain and stress, then you're going to get ineffective performance. Ineffective performance. There's a kind of breakdown product, and that's pretty much what Hans Selye won the Nobel Prize for with his studies of laboratory rats. Okay, but at the human level, what we were finding is that when stress and strain were high for a long enough period of time to deplete your organism, you would get various physical illnesses, heart disease, cancer, Alzheimer's, things like that, various physical illnesses, and mental burnout, disorders of depression, anxiety, things of that sort, and behavioral apathy, the inability to function. Okay, no energy, inability to function. We found that happened. We saw evidence of that in our sample. The other thing is, of course, that up on top there, that little box up on top, inherited vulnerabilities. We also found that whatever your, you know, when you inherit from your parents strengths and weaknesses, genetically determined strengths and weaknesses. What we were finding is that, you see, because we had medical records on these people for a long period of time, because at that time, Illinois Bell Telephone would give a free physical examination to each employee once a year. Can't do that anymore, right? Um, but in any event, what we were finding is that when ineffective performance happened, the breakdowns tended to be along the lines of inherited vulnerabilities. In my case, for example, Maddi, M-A-D-D-I, is an uncommon enough name that whenever somebody gets in touch with me because they have the same name, it turns out we're related, okay? And then, of course, we start sharing what we know about the family members we grew up with. And it turns out that although people with my name tend to live a long time, when they die, it's usually heart-related. So there must be some genetic something going on there, right? Okay, so that's the bad news. But the good news that we found is down below there. The hardy attitudes of commitment, control, and challenge. The third of the sample that survived and thrived after the breakdown, or after the change, the deregulation, before the deregulation, had shown signs of those three C's. For example, one of the managers who had survived and thrived after the deregulation, when we had interviewed him about what is it like to work at Illinois Bell Telephone, he said, well, to be a good manager at Illinois Bell Telephone, you have to have a bell-shaped head. Ma Bell, right, you know? But what did he mean? We asked him what he meant, and he took us over to his bookshelves, and he showed us essentially an encyclopedia, a whole about 10 or 15 volumes, published by AT&T, American Telephone and Telegraph, which was the parent company of Illinois Bell Telephone. And he says, you know, I'm a manager, right? Yes, you're a manager. Well, what happens when a problem comes up, he says. What happens when a problem comes up? Well, I don't know, you tell us. Well, when a problem comes up, I don't think about it myself and figure out what to do. I go to this encyclopedia, look it up, look it up, and it tells me what to do. And to be a good manager at Illinois Bell Telephone, that's the way you have to function. So he was saying his own capabilities were not being used. Now, after the deregulation, he did much better. He had more energy, more enthusiasm. He rose to the top of the heap, okay, because he could do more. He wasn't being restricted, okay. So that the hardy attitudes there. Now, those hardy attitudes we found lead to coping in a hardy way with stresses rather than by denial and avoidance or feeling victimized and striking back. Feeling victimized and striking back or denying and avoiding are what we call regressive coping. What was important here for the people who survived and thrived was problem solving or hardy coping. And you'll see more about what's involved there when we get on to the next slide. But anyway, that coping was very, very important. And you see a line up there because it decreased the stressfulness of the circumstances and therefore decreased strain and the likelihood of ineffective performance. Hardy attitudes also increased hardy social support. In other words, instead of letting relationships with significant others, the conflicts in relationships with significant others fester, or just pulling away from them. Hardy social support involved recognizing those conflicts and trying to resolve them through the way you communicate and replace them with a mutual pattern of giving and getting assistance and encouragement. These are significant others, like the people you work with. giving and getting assistance and encouragement rather than just letting the stressful circumstances, the conflicts fester or pulling away. Okay? And then finally, hearty health practices. What we found there is with regard to relaxation, whenever the stress got too high, these people who survived and thrived after the deregulation tended to use relaxation activities. They, in terms of nutrition, they avoided the tendency to eat sweet and fatty foods, which is what the body tells you to do when you're under stress. They avoided that tendency, so they didn't gain a lot of weight or undermine their health. And they did physical exercise rather than just laying in bed and watching TV. And of course, health supplements. So you see those four boxes at the bottom, which is the good news of hardiness. The arrows go in both directions. What that means is that, the hearty health practices have their effectiveness is by decreasing strain. It doesn't decrease stressful circumstances. Unfortunately, some physicians, when you're under stress, they just tell you to engage in hearty health practices. They don't tell you anything about hearty coping, right? It's not enough, but at least hearty health practices decrease strain, which also has an overall effect of decreasing ineffective performance under stress. But if you put those four together at the bottom, the reason the arrows are in both directions is that hearty attitudes, one direction is that hearty attitudes provide the courage and motivation to do the hard work of hearty social support, hearty coping, and hearty health practices. But now what we've also found out in the training of hardiness, and we'll get onto that later, the training of hardiness, is that if you put people through, force them to go through, because they're in a course with you, force them to go through hearty coping, hearty social support, and hearty health practices, that will also deepen. You can also teach them how to use the feedback they get from that to deepen their hearty attitudes. So when the course is over, they can carry it on by themselves because they now have the courage and motivation to do so. That's very important. Once again, many people don't recognize that who try to help people with stress. I've done psychotherapy. Where I live in Laguna Beach, California, is very wealthy. I've done a lot of psychotherapy with people in companies, managers who feel overwhelmed with stress and whatnot. And it turns out oftentimes they go to a spa for a week, once a year, usually paid for by their spouse as a present. And at the spa, they learn about hearty health practices mostly. They may even learn a little bit about hearty coping and hearty social support, a little bit. But you know what? They're never taught to use the feedback they get from those efforts to deepen their hearty attitudes. It's as if the hearty attitudes aren't recognized. So when they go back home, they have all this information that if they followed through on it, it would be helpful, but they don't follow through on it. Okay? So anyway, that's the hardiness model. I'm afraid I'm going to run out of time, so I just want to go quickly. There's a lot of hardiness research. It's not just beyond the Illinois Bell telephone study. A lot of hardiness research has been going on all around the world, by the way. Our measure of hardiness has been translated into more than 20 foreign languages. In any event, I'm just going to go very quickly through this. Hardiness in military missions is Paul Bartone, who's a graduate student of mine. He's now oh, thank you, that'll help. He's now a colonel in the Army. He found that he measured hardiness right before U.S. Army personnel were deployed overseas in either peacekeeping or military missions or war missions. And what he found is The higher their hardiness levels before they were deployed, the more they avoided, when they encountered life-threatening circumstances, the more they avoided sinking into post-traumatic stress disorder and depression disorders. These are all published papers. Hardy Attitudes and Culture Shock. Michael Attella, he was also a graduate student of mine. I supervised all their dissertations. This was his dissertation. He measured hardiness on a group of business people right before they were deployed to China to help teach the Chinese computer technology. This was years ago, it was 20 years ago. And what he found is that when it was a 2-year mission for these people, what he found was that as soon as they got to China, they all deteriorated. Culture shock was just like really hard for them. They all deteriorated. But over the 2-year period, those who were higher in hardiness, having been measured that in the United States, those who were higher in hardiness increased more completely, improved more completely and faster than those who were low in hardiness. A lot of them were low in hardiness, had to be sent home because it wasn't working out. Hardy attitudes and substance use. Patik Wadwa was a graduate student of mine also, higher as an MD. We did this study at UCI. This was done on high school graduates who had been admitted to UCI, but it was in the summer. The study was done in the summer when they were going through, help them understand what it would be like to be in college rather than high school. And we studied their hardiness levels and also their substance use. The substance use was studied not only by questionnaires, but also by urine samples. And we found that the higher the hardiness level, the lower the substance use in these people. Okay? There's a lot more that could be said, but it'll take forever, so I won't do it. They're all published papers. Hardiness and basketball performance. Mike Hess was an undergraduate of mine at UCI. He was also the star guard on the basketball team. And he wanted to do an honors study, and this was his honors study. I helped him figure out what to do. But in any event, he measured hardiness levels on varsity male basketball players in high school in the summer before the basketball season began. And then he got information as to how they had performed throughout the season when it took place. There were 7 measures of effective performance, like number of points scored, number of assists, things like that, those of you who know basketball. And he found that 5 out of the 7 measures, the higher the hardiness levels was in the summer, the better the performance on 5 out of those 7 measures during the year. He got that information from their coaches, right? And of the 2 that weren't, where there wasn't a correlation, one was number of free throw points. Those of you know that the only calm in a basketball game is when you step up to the line to throw a free throw. Everything else is madness, right? So with the madness, hardiness made a difference. Okay. Hardy attitudes in military training. Mina Westman, she's at Tel Aviv University, did this study on Israeli military who were about to enter officer training school. She measured their hardiness levels, and then she saw how they did in officer training school. And this is what she found. Those who were high in hardiness described the training, the officer training school training, as very stressful and graduated successfully. Those who were low in hardiness described the training as a piece of cake and tended to fail out. Okay? Enough said. And then Hardiness, Attitudes, and Leadership, Bartone and Snook, the same Bartone. This is a published paper also on West Point military cadets. He followed them for the 4 years of their training and found that the higher the hardiness attitudes were before the training began, the better these scores these people would have on measures of transformational leadership. That is trying to bring the best out of your the people you're supervising. Okay. Hardy attitudes and billable hours, creativity, authoritarianism, existential meaning, and hardy skills. These studies were all done by me and various students of mine. And basically what it shows is that the higher your hardiness attitudes, if you're an entrepreneur, the more billable hours you get to be able to charge people for. The more billable hours. To get billable hours, you have to find clients and service them well so they stay on as clients, right? So hardiness helped there. It also helped in creativity with another sample, a different sample. The higher the hardiness level, the more on a measure of creativity called unusual uses, where I better not go into it all, it'll take too long. The higher the hardiness level, the lower authoritarianism. The higher the hardiness level, the higher existential meaning, and the higher those hardy skills were in those samples, okay? Then finally, Don Lifton at a college in upstate New York found that the higher the hardiness levels of students just entering college, the greater their retention rate subsequently. Now we've found just recently that the higher the hardiness levels of undergraduate students at UCI, then when they graduate, we looked at their GPAs, and the higher their hardiness levels, the more their GPAs had improved during their time in college. And then finally, hardy attitudes and firefighter recruits. This was done at Long Beach Fire Academy. And what they came to us because they were their recruits were dropping out, and it was costing a lot of money, and it was difficult. And so what we did was we measured hardy attitudes in recruits before they started. And what we found is that in the 4.5 months of very stressful training, believe me, it's really stressful. I could give you all sorts of examples, but there's no time. What we found was that the higher their hardiness levels, the greater the likelihood that they would graduate successfully. Okay? All right, I better go on because I'm not going to be able to go into this. All I can say is that we did comparative analytic studies to try to see the relative effectiveness of hardiness and some other variables that are big things in psychology these days. What we found is that hardiness is a better predictor of problem-solving coping and avoidance of denial and of regressive coping than is optimism, Seligman's scale of optimism. Okay, hardiness versus religiousness. What we found is that in colonels and up in the U.S. Army, we found that hardiness is a better predictor, a better negative predictor of depression and anger than is religiousness. Now, religiousness here was measured pretty much by your practice of your religion. It would have been better if we had a measure of religiousness that was more spiritual. Okay? And then finally, this isn't even published yet, but it's on the way. Subjective well-being is a good predictor of GPA at UCI undergraduates, but you know what? Hardiness is a much stronger predictor of GPA. So what it suggests is that optimism and subjective well-being have a quality of complacency in them, whereas hardy attitudes are courage. It's not optimism and sense of subjective well-being. It's, hey, you gotta work to make your life really be good. Okay, so that's what it's all about. The hardy organization. Okay. There, at the level of culture, the culture of the organization, a hardy organization includes the values of cooperation, credibility, and creativity. Now, these are isomorphic with the 3 C's at the individual level. Commitment at the individual level becomes cooperation at the organizational level. Control at the individual level becomes credibility. And challenge at the individual level becomes creativity. So the values of a hardy organization include cooperation, credibility, and creativity as important in the functioning of the organization and the people in it. Now, in terms of climate, the climate of the organization, a hardy climate involves walking that talk. You can't just say you need to have cooperation, credibility, creativity. It's actually got to be done on a day-to-day, moment-to-moment basis. So they have to walk the talk. At the level of organizational structure, what's better than the pyramidal structure that has been so common in organizations is matrix management. In other words, lots of small groups working on particular problems. And of course, the head of each of those small groups becomes a member of a kind of overall leadership team. But you need small groups working together rather than the pyramidal kind of approach, which leads to incredible bureaucracy, the pyramidal approach. And then finally, at the level of personnel, the hardy organization needs to get as many workers with high hardiness as possible. And if they don't have high hardiness, the company needs to be willing to train hardiness for them. Okay? So that's what makes a hardy organization. Specifics of hardiness practice at the individual level. I can't go into this too much because there's no time, but we do have something we call the Hardy Survey 3rd edition revised, Hardy Survey 3R. It's a 65-item test, which you can take on our website, which is down there below, the website address. You just go to the right of the first page, and it says take the survey, and you click on that. You can take the survey, and then you can get a comprehensive report on the vulnerability factors, stress, strain, and regressive coping, and the resilience factors, hardy attitudes, hardy coping, hardy work support, hardy family support, and hardy self-care. And the report puts it all together for you and makes recommendations. Okay? Here's an example of the profile that somebody got on the report. Stress is pretty high, strain is even higher, regressive coping is quite high, and total vulnerability, which is a combination of those three, is really high. Down below, hardy attitudes are much lower than you would want. Hardy coping is incredibly much lower than regressive coping. The social support indices are not that high either, so the total resistance, which is a combination of those four, is much lower than the total vulnerability. So you can imagine what the report says to you. Okay? Now, I'm not going to be able to go into this because we have to stop at 10, right? Lillian? We have to stop at 10? Okay, I'm not going to be able to go into this, but in any event, basically what we do in our training is there's training on hardy coping, hardy social support, hardy relaxation, meditation, hearty nutrition, and hearty exercise. Those are the 5 fingers of the hand. But we also teach you how to use the feedback you get from that training to deepen your hearty attitudes, which is the palm of the hand. And the fingers don't work without a palm, right? Okay. Now, that training program has, up to this point, up to recently, been done by certified hardiness trainers with small groups of trainees with a workbook. Okay. We still do that, but now it's also possible to take the training on your own on that website, www.hardytraining.coursehost.com. You can just go there and take the training on your own. Okay. Now, there's no way of going into all of this. Those of you who are coming to my workshop later this morning, we can cover it there, okay? Because there's no time. Yeah, can't do this. There's research on hardy training research showing that in working adults and in college students, the training makes an effect on improving performance and morale and emotions. These are published studies. Now, at the organizational level, if you're doing consulting for an organization and you want to use hardiness, there has to be an assessment, which is the hardiness of the culture, climate, structure, and personnel along the lines that I mentioned before. The techniques you can use are interviews with key personnel, review of documents, on-site observations, and aggregate hardy survey findings. And to implement what you find out, you need to propose and facilitate the needed changes. And the techniques there are recommendations, organizational consulting, coaching, and hardy training. Okay? Now, I'm just going to close with this. This is when we were consulting for a large California, well-known California healthcare company. And what we did for them, one of the things we did for them was a group study of the hardy attitudes that were measured with the hardy survey. Well, everything, not just the hardy attitudes, but everybody in the company took the hardy survey, and this is the results that we found. Stress was pretty low, strain was higher, regressive coping was pretty high, vulnerability was not terrible, but there. Hardy attitudes were quite high. Hardy coping was very high, much higher than regressive coping, which is good. Work support was quite high. Social support at work was pretty high. So the resistance factor was much higher than the vulnerability factor. And the overall performance index was really high, putting it all together. Okay, so the company was in good shape, according to this study. And that same company was then compared with other companies in our database. And what we found is that those companies were compared for stress, strain, regressive coping, hardy attitudes, hardy coping, hardy work support, and hardy social family support. And you can see these could be very helpful to an organization to kind of understand where things are going in the organization. So let me stop. It's 2 minutes early.